Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on our own devices. I'm Jean Messi, and today I'm having a look at a device that you might have seen in a number of movies and TV shows, but maybe not paid that much attention to. This is a stenograph or stenotype, and this is a machine used by court stenographers or reporters to create the official record of court proceedings. Now, stenotypes are part of a larger family of writing systems known as stenography, from the Greek stenos, meaning narrow, and graphein, meaning writing, so narrow writing or short writing, also known as shorthand. And these systems are used to increase the rate at which language, specifically spoken language, can be written down. So say you are a secretary taking dictation, or you're a journalist writing down the responses from an interviewee, or writing down the speech from a politician. Doing this using regular longhand, regular orthography, is often very slow and cumbersome. You really can't keep up with the speed at which regular language is spoken. Stenographic systems reduce the number and complexity of symbols needed to write down language so that words can be written down as quickly as they can be spoken. Hence why these systems are also sometimes known as brachyraphy, or short writing, or tachygraphy, fast writing. So handwritten stenographic systems have been around for centuries, and one of the first successful systems, in the English language at least, was invented in 1626 by Englishman Thomas Shelton, and his system has the distinction of being extensively used both by the English diarist Samuel Pepys and the scientist Sir Isaac Newton. So like pretty much every other stenographic system, Shelton's was phonemic, meaning that it broke down language not into entire words, but rather into phonemes, or individual syllables or sounds. And how this worked is that you would compose each syllable from a starting consonant and an end consonant. And where you place the end consonant in relation to the starting consonant indicated what vowel was supposed to go in between. So for example, if your consonant started with a B and ended with a T, depending on where around the B you place the T, you could spell out bit, bot, bat, bet, etc. And because this was a completely phonemic system, it didn't employ conventional spelling. So for example, if you wanted to write bought, as in I went to the store and bought this, you wouldn't write out B-O-U-G-H-T, you would just write B-O-T. And from just sounding it out and from the context, you'd be able to figure out what word you meant. Now, this is a fairly simple system, but it did have some limitations, and the main one being that you couldn't easily differentiate between lengths of vowels. So for example, if you did write out B-O-T, that could be bought, yes, but it could also be boot. There was no system for figuring out the difference. You'd have to figure that out from context. But thankfully, when it comes to shorthand, most shorthand users come up with their own little twists and quirks of actually how to use the system. No two people write shorthand the same way. And so if you're transcribing your own work, you're usually able to figure out from your own quirks, from your own methodology, and from context, what you actually meant and what was actually written down. It gets a little bit more complicated, though, when somebody else is trying to transcribe your work from scratch. So despite these limitations, Shelton's system was still fairly successful, and it went through 20 different editions between 1626 and 1710. But the most familiar types of shorthand systems were invented in the 19th century, and the two most common are the Pitman system and the Gregg system. So Pitman shorthand was invented in 1837 by Isaac Pitman, and this consisted of a system of very simple glyphs composed of straight and curved lines that were meant to be written very quickly. And these glyphs represented individual phonemes. Now, what's interesting about the Pitman system is that it's meant to be used, for the most part, without any vowels. You just write down the consonants, and then from context or from sounding it out, you can usually figure out what the word is supposed to be, and this makes it a lot faster to use. Now, of course, there are situations in which you get quite a bit of ambiguity, where you can create two completely different words if you insert different vowels, and for this, there is an entire system of glyphs in the Pitman system that can be used in those situations. So you can use it without, and then you have those glyphs available if you actually need to use them. Now, this isn't nearly as unusual as it might seem. In fact, there are full languages that work in exactly the same way. For example, ancient languages like ancient Egyptian and modern Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew are composed mainly of consonants, and you're supposed to fill in the vowel sounds yourself based on context and your familiarity with the spoken language. Now, of course, there are situations in which you don't want there to be any ambiguity in terms of pronunciation. For example, in texts meant for beginners who are just learning the language, or religious texts that are meant to be spoken aloud, and you don't want any misinterpretation or mispronunciation. So these languages have developed a system of what are known as diacritical marks in order to add in the proper vowel sounds. And in Hebrew, these are known as nikud. So very similar system to many types of shorthand. Now, another quirk of the Pitman system was how it distinguished between long and short vowel sounds and voiced and unvoiced syllables. So, for example, a voiced syllable would be z, whereas an unvoiced syllable would be s. So to distinguish between the two, you write the lines either thick or thin. And initially, special pens were developed for this purpose, but later, stenographers just started using pencils because you can very easily use one to create unambiguously thin or thick lines by applying different amounts of pressure. And using the Pitman system, you could reach a word per minute of around 350 in the hands of an experienced stenographer. Now, the other common written shorthand system from the 19th century was the Gregg system, invented by John Gregg in 1888. And this was very similar to the Pitman system, but instead of using thin or thick lines to distinguish between voiced and unvoiced syllables, the Gregg system used the length of the lines or little curved additions on the glyphs, which was a lot less ambiguous when writing very quickly or with a non-optimal writing implement that really can't do thick or thin lines easily. And while the Pitman and Gregg stenographic alphabets were the most commonly known and used throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, there were a number of other competitors that were also developed, including the Byram, Taylor, Gurney, Gabelsberger, Graham, Munson, Lindsley, and Pernin systems. Now, in parallel with the development of the typewriter, which allowed regular longhand to be written out more efficiently, inventors started coming up with various mechanical means of writing out shorthand. And some of the first such devices were invented in 1830 by German inventor Karl Drais and in 1863 by Italian inventor Antonio Zucco. And Zucco's invention saw some success. It was actually being used in the 1880s to write down the proceedings of the Italian Senate. However, the first modern stenographic machine is typically credited to American inventor Miles Bartholomew, who patented his design in 1879. And like most stenographic machines that came afterwards, Bartholomew's design had far fewer keys than a regular typewriter keyboard. It had a total of 10. 4 for the fingers of the right hand, 4 for the fingers of the left hand, 1 key shared by the thumbs of both hands, and then a space bar on top. And this didn't actually print out letters. Rather, it printed out a code of dashes. It looked very much like Morse code, arranged in 5 columns. And by typing out various combinations of these dashes in the different columns, you could spell out different letters. And despite being vaguely similar to later stenographs, this actually worked in a very different way. And the logic behind Bartholomew's design was when you were using a regular typewriter, your fingers had to go all over the keyboard in order to reach different letters, and this wasted time. Also, sometimes you were typing out large parts of words that only used the keys on one side of the keyboard, and this left the other hand with nothing to do, and he found this very inefficient. So the idea behind his keyboard is that your fingers would not move. They would stay in the same position on these 5 keys per hand, and thus each hand could actually print out any letter. There was no asymmetry between the 2 halves of the keyboard. And what you would do is you would actually alternate between both hands, and you could spell out any letter, and thus you could actually type a lot faster than with an asymmetric keyboard. So rather interesting system. And while it wasn't nearly as successful as later stenographic machines, it was still used to a limited extent until 1937. So the next major development in stenograph machines was a device patented in 1889 by George Kerr Anderson. And his device introduced a feature that would become fairly standard on all stenographs that were to come, which was the corded keyboard. So rather than typing the keys individually as you would on a typewriter, you could actually depress multiple keys simultaneously, sort of like the chords on a piano keyboard, to create different combinations of symbols. And his device used actual letters rather than the dashes on Bartholomew's machine. Now, Kerr's machine had 14 rather than 10 keys, 2 of which were actually meant to be pressed by the wrist by tilting your hand back as so. And these keys were arranged into 3 tiers based on the frequency of the letters being used, going from the most commonly used letters all the way to the least commonly used letters. And you would shift between these 3 different tiers using a shift key. Now, Kerr's device was not actually all that successful, but it does have a claim to fame that it was used to record President William McKinley's inaugural speech in 1897. However, the most successful design of stenographic machine, and the one that would go on to become the de facto standard for more than a century, was introduced in 1911 by Wardstone Ireland, who founded the Universal Stenotype Company in Owensboro, Kentucky, to manufacture and market the machine. And the company got a huge publicity boost in 1914 when they entered their machine in the National Shorthand Reporters Association speed contest, and the machine beat out 30 pen and paper stenographers handily with an accuracy of 99.3%. And by the 1930s and 40s, machines like this were standard in courtrooms and news offices all around the country. And in a minute, we'll talk about exactly how these work. Now, unfortunately, this company didn't last very long. Like a lot of companies during the First World War, they accepted government munitions contracts. And when the war ended, the government didn't buy up any of their excess stocks. They had all these munitions, all this inventory that they couldn't sell, and they went bankrupt. They also had a huge contract with the Russian government that also went south when the Bolsheviks took over. However, in 1927, the LaSalle University Extension, which was a secretarial school, purchased the rights to Stenotype and started producing the models under its own brand names, which was the Master Model 4. And that's one of these. This is a LaSalle Stenotype. And that company still exists today as Stenotype LLC, based in Elmhurst, Illinois. And they still produce Stenotype machines, not exactly like this, more modern versions, and they dominate 90% of the market. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. First, let's pull this out of its box and show you how this actually works. So here we have our LaSalle stenograph taken out of its carrying case, and really there's not much interesting, mechanically speaking, going on inside of this machine. It's actually pretty basic. So if we lift up this cover, we'll see that we have a spool of ribbon, just like on a regular typewriter. We have a set of 22 letter keys here that when you hit the keys on the keyboard will push forward into the ribbon and onto the spool of paper to print the symbols. And of course, there is a cam mechanism that with each key press advances the spool of paper through the machine. And how that works is actually quite interesting. Standard stenographic paper has 22 columns to match the 22 keys. And it's loaded into this little drawer in the back here. And it actually comes pre-folded in accordion fashion back and forth. And when it is set up, it actually draws paper from the bottom of the stack, runs it through the machine where the text is printed on it, and then lays it back down layer by layer on top of the stack. So everything is self-contained. You don't have this reel of paper spilling out over your table and onto the floor that needs to be gathered up later. Everything is contained, and you can pull out this neat stack of stenograph paper to do your transcription later. So I find that kind of neat. So as I said, not much going on mechanically. What makes this interesting is the whole stenographic system that this is based off of, how this actually works. So if we look at the keyboard, we'll see that, as with pretty much every other stenographic machine, this has far fewer keys than a regular keyboard. In fact, this has 22. And these are divided into 3 zones. We have our starting consonants, which are meant to be typed by the fingers of the left hand. We have our end consonants, which are meant to be typed by the fingers of the right hand. And we have our vowels down here, which are meant to be pressed by the thumbs of both hands. And finally, we have our numeral bar at the top here, which is like a shift key. And this switches between letters and numerals to allow you to write numbers. Now, you'll notice that there are no letters actually written on these keys. The actual layout of the letters is as follows. I will superimpose those onto the keys for you. So what you'll notice immediately here is that there's quite a few letters missing from this keyboard. Indeed, the Stenotype keyboard leaves out the letters C, I, M, J, N, Q, V, X, and Y. So another key way in which the Stenotype differs from a regular typewriter is in having a chorded keyboard. And as I mentioned before, this means that multiple keys can be depressed at once, sort of like playing the keys on a piano keyboard. in order to create different letter combinations on the same row. And the idea behind this is that it allows you to spell out an entire phoneme and sometimes an entire word in a single stroke of the keys. And this allows you to follow a person's speech a lot faster, going phoneme by phoneme or word by word, than letter by letter with a regular typewriter. So this seems pretty simple. However, some of the specific design details of the Stenotype that allow it to reach these word per minute counts present complications and quirks that the properly trained Stenotype operator needs to learn to work around. So for example, unlike a standard typewriter, this doesn't have a moving carriage, meaning that these letters can't actually be placed just anywhere on the paper. They are locked into their individual columns. So if I were to depress all of these keys at once, you would see this combination of letters show up. Now, you'll notice that while this is divided into starting consonants, middle vowels, and ending consonants, it's not symmetrical. There are letters on one side of the row that aren't on the other. So for example, B is present in the end consonants and not in the starting consonants, and K is in the starting consonants but not in the end consonants, which means that different letter combinations need to be used where the proper letter isn't present. And also letter combinations need to be used where the letter isn't present on either side at all. Another quirk is then how you have to write numbers. So you can write a number in one single stroke of the keys if the constituent numerals in that number are in numerical order. So for example, I can write 1, 2, 3 in one stroke, but I can't write 3, 2, 1 in one stroke. I have to write 3, 2, 1 in different rows. So let's have a closer look at this and look at some of the interesting letter combinations that this system requires. So the full list of keystrokes for the Stenotype is very long, so I'm just going to give you a handful of examples. So within the initial consonants, B isn't present, so you write B as a combination PW. There is no C anywhere on the keyboard, so if you want to write a hard C, you write it as K, and a soft C as KR. D is TK, G is TKPW, and V is SR. Now within the vowels, you need to be able to distinguish between the short and long vowels. So a short A is just A, but if you want a long A, that's A plus an EU modifier. A W, ah, is AU. A short E would just be regular E, whereas a long E is AOE, the AO acting as a modifier. I isn't present, so for a long I, you put AOEU. Regular short O would just be O, whereas a long O would be OE, again, the modifier, and then the long U is AOU. In the end consonants, B, D, F, and G are the same as their regular letters. The ch sound is FP, J is PBLG, M is PL, V is asterisk F, and K is BG. And finally, you'll notice that on the keyboard, there are no punctuation marks, meaning that these also need to be represented with letter combinations. So for example, a period is FPLT, a comma is RBGS, question mark is STPH, and a new paragraph is PF. If you actually look on the keyboard, these are just random groupings of keys that are right beside each other, so it makes for a very easy combination to find on the keyboard. And so to show you some of the complications and nuances that come with using this system to type out words, let's try an example. Let's try writing out Cabinet of Curiosities on our own devices using the Stenotype. So let's start with the first syllable, cab. So that would just be K, A, and B, but I can't write another vowel because the vowels are in the middle and we've already skipped over them. So we need to go down to another line to write the next syllable, in, which would be EU for the I sound, and then PB for the N. And then, again, we've skipped over our vowels, so we need to go to another line to write the last syllable, which is ET, which is ET. So now we can move on to of. That can be done in one line with an O and an F. So now we are on curiosities. We can write the first syllable, cure, with a K for the hard C, an AOU for the long U, and then an R. The long E sound we write with AOE, but we've skipped over the O now, so now we can't do O on that line. We skip down to the next line and do an O and an S. Then we do it with an EU and a T, and then E's as AOE for the long E, and then S. And then finally we have on, which is just O and PB. Hour we can spell out just as it's spelled normally with an O-U-R. O-E-P-B for own. Then for devices, D in the initial consonants needs to be spelled out T-K, then a regular E, and then an asterisk F for the V, and then A-O-E-U for the I sound, and then S for the soft C, and then finally an E-S. So that was my own best attempt at using the strict rules of the stenograph alphabet in order to write out that sentence. But the thing about stenography is that with enough practice and experience, stenographers will come up with their own theories or rule sets on how to use the stenograph. And this includes a bunch of personalized briefs or abbreviations that are unique to each stenographer. So no two people will write out stenography in the same way, and they will constantly be looking for little tips and techniques and shortcuts in order to make the system even briefer and faster to use. And to show you how these shortcuts can be used to make a stenographic sentence even shorter, I typed in that same sentence, Cabinet of Curiosities on Our Own Devices, into Plover, which is an online program that translates plain text into stenography, and its version of that same sentence was significantly shorter than mine. So right in the first line, you can see the use of common abbreviations for common words. So instead of spelling out cabinet as cab-i-net, it's just K-A-B-T, which a stenographer will be able to recognize as cabinet. Same thing with of, no need to put in the O, you just need to put in the F on its own, and that's recognizable as the very common word of. Curiosities is very similar to the way that I spelled it out. However, it has eliminated some of the syllables, especially the first I, so it's just curiosties. Reassuringly, on our own is spelled out exactly like I did, and devices has also had a syllable removed where it's just devices. So as I hope this example clearly demonstrates, there's a great deal of finesse and nuance that goes into properly learning and applying stenography, as there is with any language. And this is why it takes someone around 2 to 3 years of training and practice before they can become proficient enough at stenography to become an official licensed court reporter. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that the stenograph company still exists. In fact, they dominate 90% of the stenography market. However, they no longer produce mechanical stenograph machines like this one. Rather, they produce digital versions. And these consist of a keyboard with the same key layout as these older machines, which can then be loaded with special software that can translate the stenographic script into proper written English or whatever other language is being used. So these new digital systems have a number of advantages over the older machines. Firstly, they reduce the need for another type of specialist known as a scopist, who traditionally assisted the stenographer by translating the stenographic writing out of the machine into plain written language. The machine can do it itself, and the stenographer can make last-minute edits at the end. Also, it allows the stenographer to have a great deal more flexibility because they can update the software, they can update the libraries to include all of their own idiosyncratic briefs, all of their shortcuts and abbreviations. So the computer can learn to read their particular brand of shorthand and translate it directly, which makes the whole system a lot more efficient. And so keyboards like this are still widely used this day by court reporters, as well as by closed captioners. So if you see a television show that has the closed captions, those are being generated live by somebody with a keyboard identical to this one. So while the traditional Stenotype layout is still the de facto standard for stenographic keyboards today, it's not the only system out there on the market. For example, in 1933, a Dutchman named Marius den Utten patented a system that he called the tachotype, which was later upgraded to a digital version in 1983 by a German inventor named Rudolf Nietzsche. And this differs from the Stenotype in that there's a lot more keys and that the two different sections of keys are symmetrical. They've got the same layout of letters. And the advantage to this is that it's a lot easier to learn in that you don't need to memorize all of these wacky combinations for one side or the other where there are letters missing. And also it allows for more conventional orthography. It allows you to spell words more in the same fashion that they would normally be spelled. And this is an advantage when it comes to uncommon words, whereas a stenographer using a Stenotype system would have to slow down and spell out an uncommon word syllable by syllable. With the Velotype system, you can type these words more easily in a manner more resembling how they would normally be spelled. So it has some advantages in certain cases and some disadvantages in others. And there are a whole bunch of other competing systems on the market, some of the most common being BAT, PsyKey, FrogPad, and MicroWriter. So something you've probably been wondering since the very beginning of the video is, why do we still use court stenographers? Why not just record trials using audio or video equipment and transcribe the audio later? Well, the reason has to do with the unpredictable nature of human speech. So during a trial, you're likely to have instances where people speak indistinctly, where they're mumbling or they're yelling. People will talk over one another. There'll be loud noises like, say, chairs scraping that will obscure the audio. Or there might be a problem with the audio equipment itself that causes certain words to become incomprehensible. So all of these factors can lead to sections that cannot be transcribed. And this is a problem because you need a full, complete, and unambiguous court record in order to make a proper judgment. So if you have a stenographer, there are a number of advantages, certain things you can do that you can't do with recording equipment. So for example, if a stenographer doesn't understand what a witness is saying, they can ask them to repeat themselves so they can actually have an official, clear record of what they actually said. Or say if the judge or a lawyer wants a statement repeated from the record, if you have a recording device, you have to stop that recording device, rewind it, and play that section. And anything that happens while that's being done isn't going to be recorded. Whereas a stenographer can simply pull out what they've written and read verbatim what was said. So although it might seem like a rather old-fashioned and crude and unreliable system for recording official proceedings, in this particular case, stenographers do have advantages over recording equipment, although recording equipment is still used in certain circumstances. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities, where we'll look at yet more fascinating devices and maybe writing systems just like this one. Until then, I'm Jules Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.